Hello everyone and welcome to the second in a series of webinars by the Cluster Centre. As a quick introduction, I'm Owen Kennedy from the Cluster Centre, which is an Irish company that supports the development of industry clusters in the islands. Claude Barry, the Cluster Centre founder, is also on the call, and Claude will be moderating the Q&A. Our focus is on supporting clusters to achieve their potential. This could be through strategic insights, cluster-specific support services, cluster manager training and development, peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, and bringing in international best practice. Today, our presenter is Dr. James Wilson. James is the Director of Research at the Orkestra-Basque Institute of Competitiveness and teaching facility at the Deusto Business School. His research is focused on policy-relevant analysis of territorial competitiveness, including territorial strategy making, governance, cluster, and innovation policy. He's published widely on these issues in peer-reviewed journals and academic books, and is currently leading mapping and analytical work within the European Cluster Collaboration Platform. He's regularly invited as an expert speaker and advisor by institutes such as the European Commission and by national and regional governments, and is a member of the board of directors of TCI Network. Today's topic area is clusters and cluster policy in COVID context. Over the course of 30 minutes, James will start from basic principles of clusters, which center on leveraging the power of cooperation. He will then explore how policy can use clusters to implement a range of policies that are central to regional resilience as we rebuild from the COVID pandemic. The ground rules for today, James will present for approximately 20-30 minutes before opening up to questions and joint exploration. Everyone is muted, but we do encourage you to use your web cameras and to submit questions or comments via the chat function. As we're a small group, if you wish to ask a question, please unmute yourself, call out James' name, followed by your own and organization and your comment or question. This will stop us talking over each other. If you encounter problems with broadband, please bear with us as we may need to pause the camera. This session is being recorded. And without further delay, I'll pass you over to Dr. James Wilson.
Thank you very much, Owen, and Claudia for the introduction and invitation to talk to you this morning about clusters and cluster policy. It's an area that is close to my heart. I've been working with clusters probably for around 20 years now, from when I first started my PhD in this area, and then most recently the last 12 years here in the Basque Country, where cluster policy is a very important feature of the landscape, of the competitiveness policy landscape. I have a cluster policy here in the Basque Country that's been going now for over 30 years, and supports a range of about 16 cluster organisations who are working in different areas of the Basque economy, largely in manufacturing clusters. What I wanted to talk about this morning essentially was to give a flavour of, well, why I think clusters are important, why they're an interesting and useful mechanism for understanding and promoting economic development, and focusing particularly on the policy side. So what can policy, how can policy use clusters, I guess, is the question I want to get to. And in particular, how can they use clusters in the context we're currently facing around rebuilding, reconceiving some aspects of our economy in the context of COVID, but also in the context of the kind of industrial transitions that our industries are going through, related to greening, relating to digital transition, relating to a more socio-economic view of the world that's also been highlighted, I think, by the COVID pandemic. So to start with, I guess the first point whenever we talk about clusters is to think about place or territory, because for me the key kind of defining feature of cluster as a concept is that it's rooted in place, and that gives us a particularly important way of understanding economic development, because when it comes to economic development, place is very important. There's been a lot of analysis and practice in economic development policy, industrial policy, particularly through the 80s and 90s, which tried to take a neutral approach to place. It assumed place didn't matter that much. We could have the same types of policies and they would do the same things everywhere. But certainly over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a growing acknowledgement that actually place matters a lot. And you can't simply introduce the same policies with the same results in different places. we really need to take place into consideration when trying to support competitiveness. And that's essentially because, as we all know, different places are very different in terms of their terrain, their resources, the people, history, culture, the type of economic activities they have located there, and also the policy competence and capacities that exist within the institutions in different places. So there you see three photos of very different places. Tulip fields in the Netherlands, and renewable energy from the city centre of Sydney, where you have a kind of high density financial centre, to the industrial basis of Birmingham in the West Midlands, where I used to work at the university there. Three very different places. The types of policies, the types of competitiveness that can be developed in those places are very different. Firms physically locate themselves in specific places for specific reasons. I think that's the basis of trying to understand clusters. We want to understand why firms are clustered together, why they co-locate with other firms in specific places. And if we can understand the reasons why firms locate in places, then it helps us to produce policy that's better targeted to their needs. And because of that location in places for specific reasons, firms become embedded in systems that are associated with the territory, those systems of knowledge in particular. Knowledge relationships, as we know, are global in many respects today, but they also rely strongly on proximity. I think that a globalization approach, in one sense, takes the focus away from place as being important, but in another sense, it actually puts the focus right back on place as being important. Because in a globalized economy, knowledge becomes the key factor of production. It becomes the kind of key competitive advantage, if you like. And knowledge, we know, relies to a large extent on human interaction between people, between institutions that are based around different types of proximity. So the concept of territorial systems of innovation, clusters, and public policies that try to boost systemic innovation in places or boost clusters have become really important over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of fostering the competitiveness of businesses. So I think that the first point to take is this, when thinking about clusters, is we have to think of them in terms of their relationship to place. Building on that, the principles that define what we might refer to as clusters have been around a long time. But they're as relevant today as ever, and in fact, I would go on to argue they're actually more relevant today. I think, in some senses, it was Alfred Marshall back in the turn of the last century who first really identified what today we term as clusters. He studied the industrial cities in the UK, in England, and Scotland in the 1900s and late 1800s, and what he observed there was this industriousness that came about through having the concentration of economic activities in one place. So you would get different districts of cities like Birmingham that were dedicated to very specific industrial activities like gun making or jewellery manufacturing. In fact, today in Birmingham, you still have a quarter of the city that's just basically a few blocks or a few streets that is dedicated solely to jewellery manufacturing, and where something like 90% of the UK's jewellery is still today produced. So he identified these industrial districts, and he argued that there was an industrial atmosphere. What happened when firms locate close together is that you generate this kind of mysterious atmosphere in the air, which enhances productivity, enhances innovation, and generates positive externalities amongst all the firms that are located there. Almost 100 years later, Michael Porter essentially built on those observations of industrial atmosphere when he coined the phrase cluster, and he started talking about the concept of a cluster. And what Porter really added to Marshall's observations and to Marshall's work and other scholars, such as particularly the Italian scholars that had studied this in terms of the Italian industrial districts in the north of Italy in the 70s and 80s, what Porter really added was this focus on the coexistence of competition and cooperation. So he kind of shone the light on actually what happens within these industrial districts or clusters where you have active firms that are conducting similar activities located close to one another. And he argued that competition can coexist with cooperation because they occur in different dimensions amongst different players. So you can have firms that are competing with one another in the same market or in related markets, but at the same time there are dimensions in which they can cooperate with one another to solve, for example, local problems or problems with the supply chains or innovation-related problems, a whole range of different areas. So the kind of basis of the cluster concept is very much this nexus of competition alongside cooperation, and how those two things belong together and coexist and generate synergies between them. I think, again, just to kind of get the concepts clear, when we talk about clusters and cluster policies, which is kind of the dual focus of this talk, it's very important to make a clear distinction between the two things, because they're not the same, and often they're taken as the same thing. Here in the Basque Country, where we have 30 years of cluster policy, there's still a lot of confusion in the language. People refer to clusters as cluster organizations or as policy organizations, whereas clusters themselves are really natural phenomenon. They're real features of economies. So I would think we can define clusters as key features of regional or local economies. They are agglomerations of firms and other agents that are engaged in related economic activities and that are characterized by competitive and cooperative dynamics together. These things occur naturally in economic geography. There's no need for any policy to promote clusters in that sense. They naturally occur because firms and other types of knowledge institutions, etc., need to locate near to one another for realizing certain external economies. Okay, so we have a natural clustering that takes place in the economy. However, on top of that, we also have a series of policies or initiatives that try to strengthen clusters, that try to generate the emergence of new clusters or strengthen existing clusters. These actions are sometimes formal in terms of a policy, or they're sometimes informal in terms of a group of firms getting together and deciding that they can collaborate in different ways. So I think we need to be careful of this distinction between clusters and cluster policies. It's useful to be very clear on that. When it comes to cluster policies or initiatives themselves, these kind of purposeful private or public actions that look to strengthen what happens in clusters, I think we can identify three broad models or three broad types of cluster policy around the world that can be useful to think about. Well, first of those is what I would call the agency model. And this is where you have an economic development agency in a region or a country which supports different clusters. So it works together with different clusters to try and strengthen what happens within those clusters. When I used to work at the University of Birmingham, and at the time in the UK, the regional development agencies were a key feature of regional economies. Advantage West Midlands was the regional development agency for Birmingham, and within that development agency, they had a remit for looking after and trying to support cooperation within a series of different clusters within the region. So that would be kind of an agency model. Secondly, you have a model which tends to be seen more in the Scandinavian countries, and this is based around cooperation projects. So you have a model where governments such as the Norwegian government or the Swedish government will fund long-term cooperation projects amongst groups of firms and other related institutions such as universities, research centres, etc. And they will fund them over different periods of time to address common challenges. Okay, so you have a kind of a project-based model. And actually, but more closer to home, this is the model that's also used in Northern Ireland through Invest Northern Ireland. Also have a cluster policy that's based around this project-based model. And then finally, we have what might be called a cluster organization model. And this is where you actually get the development of formal organizations or institutions that are tasked with facilitating cooperative dynamics within specific clusters. That's what we have here in the Basque Country. So we have 16 cluster organizations that are legal entities themselves. They receive support from government, but they also receive membership fees from firms. And it's the combination of the public support and the private buy-in which gives them their remit to work together with their members to generate those cooperative dynamics. Okay, so those are three different models or ways in which cluster policy can be operationalized or is operationalized in different parts of the world. And they're all based around essentially building on Porter's argument that cooperation and competition can and should coexist. And so they're based around leveraging the power of cooperation, trying to promote cooperation, or put it another way, to reduce the barriers to cooperation. And there are significant barriers to cooperation. Firms, as we know, I think, are reluctant in many cases to cooperate because there may be sensitive information involved. You move out of your comfort zone in a sense. So cluster organizations or cluster policies are all about trying to reduce those barriers to cooperation and encouraging stronger cooperation based around different types of trust or social capital. I would argue that cooperation becomes a potent complement to competition in Porter's terms when we meet these conditions. First of all, there needs to be a common or shared challenge. So there's something that is in the way, or a barrier to business competitiveness, that is shared across more than one firm. Okay, so it may be something like a lack of skills in the region. It may be something like barriers to entering foreign markets, international markets, which are common to a certain group of firms. Okay, so there's a challenge that is common or shared. It may be an innovation challenge, which requires cooperation across the supply chain to solve. And then alongside that common or shared challenge, we can have one of two or a combination of two scenarios. We might have different agents which have different parts of the solutions. Or we might have a case where the solution requires a certain scale or critical mass. Just to give an example, if we're thinking about an innovation challenge, trying to solve, for example, a problem related to the circular economy, trying to boost a circular economy usage in a particular industry in a particular place. When it comes to the circular economy, it's clearly something that needs to connect together different actors. So we require innovation in a systemic sense. We require innovation that brings together different firms that form part of that circular economy, that are able to innovate and change their behavior in a way that generates the circularity that we're looking for. Okay, so cooperation is needed because different agents have different part of the solutions. So 2 or 3 firms at different parts of the supply chain might have different parts of the solution. A university might have another part of the solution, and there's a need to combine them in order to generate the solution. The second example, solutions require a certain scale or critical mass, refers to, for example, the skills challenges. When it comes to, for example, skills related to Industry 4.0, which is a challenge that I think most regions are facing today, and how we generate better and more agile digital skills that are related to our industry. This is something that one firm on its own can't solve. It needs to come together with other firms, with universities, etc., in order to cooperate around that challenge. A very clear example of that, the aerospace cluster in the Basque Country today is quite an important cluster, but it's one that's grown quite rapidly over the last 20 years. And when it started to work in the aerospace field, because aerospace had not traditionally been an activity in the Basque Country, there was a lack of skills. There was a lack of aerospace qualified engineers. And so the firms that were working in the aerospace sector in the cluster, together with the cluster organization, started to collaborate with the local university here in the Basque Country and with the University of Madrid that did have capacities in aerospace engineering to bring together and create modules that would fit into the Basque Country University's engineering programs. So that was an initiative that came from the cluster itself, and that helped to solve a skills problem that was more widely felt across the industry. So the areas where cooperation projects typically emerge within clusters are these types of things: value chain development, infrastructure, innovation, standards and quality, internationalization, specialized training. These are the types of things where we usually see the need for collaboration because they meet the criteria described above. And I think that one of the things we've seen over the last 3 or 4 months, and to me, it's been very obvious through following what's been happening in policy debates at EU level and also here in Spain and in the Basque Country, is that cooperation has actually become even more valuable in the context of COVID. We saw it in the very immediate aftermath in terms of, well, how do we reconfigure supply chains in order to provide the health systems with what they need, in order to provide the PPE, in order to provide the ventilators, etc., or respirators, etc. So in that case, we saw a lot of cooperation taking place between firms, between clusters, among clusters, to try and solve a very immediate problem. And as we move into the longer term and the rebuilding, the reconceiving of supply chains, etc., then that cooperation, I think, is going to maintain its importance. We're going to see clusters, I think, become even more critical institutions or parts of regional economies, because cooperation becomes important in the context of the uncertainty that we're living at the moment. So, and three key reasons as to why I think this cooperation is, if you like, a premium is placed on it in the context of COVID. First of all, we need flows of strategic intelligence in order to optimize the combination of business and policy responses. What I mean by that is that businesses need to know what governments are doing, and governments need to know what businesses are doing and what businesses need in order to find solutions to some of the problems that we're facing in the context of COVID. That requires increased private-private collaboration, private-public collaboration, and also public-public collaboration between different departments of government, for example, between the health department and the economic development department. So in order to get that strategic intelligence flowing between different actors, I think clusters already are playing a very key role in that. And we see them, for example, here in the Basque Country, developing roadmaps together with the government that try to optimize the government's policy responses to particular sectors in line with what the firms in those sectors are doing and feeling and responding in terms of their, for example, their supply chain challenges. There's also, I think, a need to navigate this high uncertainty. We're in a context that's new for everybody and that's changing very rapidly. And that, again, puts a premium on cooperation, because sharing becomes particularly important in that context of high uncertainty. And finally, we're in a context where solutions are needed to new problems. And again, we saw that in the resistance phase to the crisis as supply chains started to pivot, and we saw clusters coming together to try and provide those solutions. And in the longer term, I think we will need to innovate in order to rebuild. For example, to rebuild in a greener way, to rebuild in a more digital way, to rebuild our economies in ways that are more resilient, that are more secure to these types of shocks, and that fundamentally move us into a greener plane or a greener state of action. And as we've seen, I think innovation is perhaps the one key area that really does require cooperation, both across firms and between firms and universities, firms and technology centres, etc. So in this sense, I think clusters are going to continue to be a key feature of policy responses over the coming years to our regional development challenges. Just to give one example from the crisis or from the pandemic, over the last 3 or 4 months, European clusters have come together quite spectacularly, I would say, to try and develop responses to the pandemic, particularly around health-related supply chains. The European Cluster Alliance has brought together hundreds of different actors, literally on a daily basis. They have 8:30 a.m. webinars every day, and have had since March, bringing together key cluster actors from across Europe, from the European Commission, from different national governments, from different regional governments, to talk about the issues and to try and share solutions and share experiences about about how we might solve some of the problems that are collectively there. Alongside that, the European Cluster Collaboration Platform set up a COVID-19 Industrial Clusters Response Portal back in April, which again has, if you go and have a look at that portal at the ECCP website, you'll see a whole range of examples of practices of where clusters are making a difference or have been making a difference to the responses at regional, national and European level. And so I think we've got lots of good examples of how this actually works in practice. Turning finally to the kind of policy side, and just to focus on the practical aspects of, well, how policy can use clusters, going back to the original question that I wanted to pose. I think to understand how policies can use, or regional competitiveness policies can use clusters, we need to go back to that first question of place being important and of connecting different types of strategies. There's been a lot of talk over the last 15 years around the importance of territorial strategies, of regions and nations having a strategy. Previously, of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, kind of industrial strategy or territorial strategy was a dirty word. It was not considered to be appropriate for places to have strategies. It was considered that places should simply create the playing field and let businesses do their thing. But that logic's been turned on its head, and it's now, I think, widely acknowledged that actually places do need to think strategically about what types of economic activities they want to develop, how they want to develop them, how the industrial transformation that takes place naturally over time can be geared and harnessed towards better economic outcomes in specific places. So territories do have strategies. At the EU level, that's seen most clearly in the European Commission's Smart Specialisation Strategy initiative, which was introduced back in 2014. And all regions, in that sense, I understand in Ireland as well, you have a very clear smart specialisation strategy that's built across the different regions. Have these territorial strategies or are thinking about these territorial strategies. So we're in a time now where thinking strategically at a territorial level is very much understood as the right thing to do. However, territorial strategies don't exist in isolation. And I would argue strongly that they're not government strategies or shouldn't be government strategies. They should actually be strategies that bring together public administration with business, with universities, with civil society to generate a strategy that brings together the different agents within a territory. So businesses, as we know, have strategies. They know where they want to go, how they want to get there, etc. We've studied. I work in a business school, and business strategy is one of the key subjects that we've studied for decades in business schools. We also know that universities, in some sense, also have strategies. They may be not as clearly defined or as clearly understood as business strategies, but universities also have a strategy as how they want to position themselves in the global marketplace and in the regional marketplace. And where clusters fit into this, I think, is that they provide a really important link between those different types of strategies, because they include within them business members, university members, technology centre members, government administrations. They're in a perfect position to link together and to try and align, in some sense, the strategies that businesses are developing with the strategies that universities are developing and with the strategies that a territory might want to develop. And that's very important, because if these things actually work in the same direction, in the right direction, then we move towards much more successful, what might be called smart specialisation strategy in the EU context. And a lot of research on smart specialisation over the last 6 or 7 years has shown that that you need these strategies to be moving in the same direction. You need to have spaces for alignment between what businesses are doing, what universities are doing, and what governments are doing. And clusters provide those spaces in many places. So that's, I think, where clusters can be particularly powerful for policy, because they provide that link back into policy from what's happening in the business world or from what's happening amongst in the research world. In that sense, instead of thinking about cluster policies, I think increasingly we're going to be thinking more about policies through clusters, using clusters for other types of policies. So rather than policies to support clusters, it's policies to link what clusters are doing to other policy objectives. We know that clusters provide these kind of soft spaces for engagement amongst the triple helix of business, university, government, perhaps also the quadruple helix of business, university, government, and civil society. And in that sense, they can support a lot of policy intelligence and policy implementation. I think one of the successes of the cluster policy in the Basque Country, which I've studied a lot over the last 12 years, has been the link between the cluster organisations and government policymakers, not just in the cluster area, but in the whole area of competitiveness policymaking. SPRI, the regional development agency here in the Basque Country, has a member of staff that is assigned essentially to monitor what's happening in each of the clusters. Those members of staff come from different areas within SPRI. Some of them work in infrastructure policy, some of them work in innovation policy, some of them work in technology policy, etc. But what they do is they provide that feedback of intelligence from what's happening on the ground in the clusters with the firms, what their needs are, what their problems are, etc. They feed back into the policy making that's taking place within SPRI in areas as diverse as innovation policy through to infrastructure policy, through to education policy, etc. Okay, so it's that link between policy intelligence which can improve policy implementation. And I use the umbrella analogy because I think they are becoming a kind of umbrella tool that's capable of serving a much wider policy agenda, from SME digitalization to skills renewal, resource efficiency, circular economy, etc. We see in the European Commission at the moment, and I'm involved with the European Cluster Collaboration Platform and doing some research and work there with that platform in terms of mapping clusters and understanding cluster dynamics in Europe. And one of the key agendas there is how we use clusters to boost the green industrial transition and the digital industrial transition. And also to boost things such as the skills renewal that's needed for those transitions. So we're increasingly seeing clusters in this kind of umbrella role, that in its kind of largest or most or broadest perspective can be seen as contributing in some sense to the Sustainable Development Goals, to linking the agendas of businesses, universities, etc., to a whole range of other economic development agendas that are represented within those goals. And I think that's where I think I've more or less exhausted my 25-30 minutes, so I'll leave it there and open for questions and comments, and happy to take on any discussion and to hear what you think about these ideas.